Welcome to today's Corporate Venturing Insider Series. Today will be quite special. We have Lisa Hehenberger from Esade, and we are going to talk about social entrepreneurship, venture philanthropy, and impact investing. So it's going to be quite a wide range of topics, which I think for our audience is not something we always talk with the same angle. So I think it's nice to have Lisa to share with us. But Lisa, welcome first.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
And let's start with maybe your journey into all these topics.
Okay. So I actually started as an investment banker. That was my first career. I was working on mergers and acquisitions in London, and then I moved to Spain, and I had this sort of feeling that I wasn't really contributing to society. Actually, more the opposite.
Yeah.
And I decided to do a PhD. To become an expert on a topic, and to be able to actually contribute much more strongly to society. And then I ran into this topic that was called venture philanthropy, which was quite new at this time. And it was really about sort of combining practices from venture capital, so about investing into companies, but much more with a philanthropic angle. So the investors were not so interested in financial return, but more interested in how can they help companies become more impactful. How can they help companies solve societal challenges, social challenges, but also environmental challenges. And I thought this was really interesting because I could sort of use my experience from finance, but actually do something good for society. So this is how I got into the topic that I've been passionate about, for the past 20 years. And this has also evolved into what we now call impact investing, which is really a combination of sort of you're investing with a combination of financial return, but also social and or environmental impact. And then I also became an academic. So I'm a professor, but I'm also an advisor, working with a number of different organizations across the investment spectrum, from philanthropy, so foundations that are providing grants to social projects, but also moving across the investment spectrum to also include impact first and finance first impact investors. And I try to see how I, through my academic research, can contribute as well, with a different perspective to these types of investors.
And so maybe I will start first with the first part of your career and how helpful it is for your second phase of your career. When you are an investment banker, this is really as rigorous as it gets, and M&A and complex and everything. When we think about impact investing, you also need rigor. And if anything, you need more rigor because it's very difficult to measure impact, or it's easier to measure financial performance. How much of that investment banking experience helped you with your role today?
Yeah, I'm laughing because I, as a professor, I also teach these topics, and sometimes with my students. And I'm a professor at a business school. Esade is a business school based in Barcelona. Um, Sometimes when I start teaching my course, students are like, "Oh, this social stuff is going to be like fluffy. We don't have, they have this impression, that there's not going to be rigor." And I think at the end of the course, they're convinced that that's not true, or that you can actually do this, with a rigorous approach and so forth. So I think that my background in investment banking has been helpful. It was, a very good training. You learn how to be, very professional, have, very strong sort of work ethic. You work long hours. You learn a lot in a few years, and I think, if you then compare the sort of financial and the impact part, that's another thing that I also mention to students, because they also think that, okay, it's going to be sort of, very subjective when it comes to impact. But actually, since I've started working on the measurement part, a lot of progress has been made. So I think now we have very good frameworks and ways of measuring, but there will always be an element of subjectivity. And then I tell my students that as an investment banker, I remember doing these like complex financial valuations of companies where my boss would say, okay, can you use discount the cash flow and these multiples and all of these different methods and come up with evaluation for this company. And I would sit there with my Excel, and I input all the information, and then I would work my numbers, and then I would come up with a range, and I would say, okay, this company is worth between 35 and 40 million euros, let's say. And my boss would look at me and he would go, that's a bit low. Can you rework the numbers? I would go back to my Excel sheet, change a few assumptions, include some other companies in the comparison for the multiples. And then I would say, okay, this is my new range. Now it's 40 to 45. But okay, yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, like it. And then when I tell my students this, they're like, okay, so maybe there's some subjectivity in financial valuations too,
Yeah, you don't credit art and science for nothing.
You're right. So, I mean, obviously, it is different when you have then sort of a price. You attribute a financial value to something, then you can trade that, and then you can compare that, and so forth. So that is obviously an advantage with financial valuations as compared to impact. Because the issue with impact is that how do you compare, for example, a project where you're working with education for girls versus an environmental project. That it's completely different topics. How do you then put a value to this? And that is a bit the difficulty of impact, that you don't have like a good comparison, and sometimes like you then need to put a monetary value so that you can compare. But then that also involves a lot of assumptions, and then you get into sometimes also ethical issues. That okay, why is the life of someone living in Europe worth more than the life of someone living in a poorer country, for example? So there could be sort of issues there, when it comes to comparison and so forth. But as I said, after many years of working on this topic, I do think that we have made a lot of progress, and there's at least now in impact investing, a bit of a kind of standardized process that investors use to assess and measure their impact. And I think we can still make this even better, but at least for the past 20 years that I've been working on this, we have made a lot of progress.
What would be good best practices for measuring impact?
Right, so I can explain a bit how impact investors do it. I didn't catch like the beginning of your question, but so I work with a few different impact investors, and there's been a bit of sort of a move, a standardization move in Europe, at least, because the European Investment Fund a few years ago launched a fund of funds. So it was a sort of a vehicle investing in impact funds. And they had a sort of requirement in terms of like how the funds that they invested in should measure their impact, which also created a bit of harmonization in the sector. what impact investors tend to do is, first of all, they have their own impact thesis at the level of the fund. Okay, so if you have, a specific investment fund, let's say that you're a venture capital investor, and you're investing in, let's say, the Netherlands, right? And then you have identified certain topics that you want to invest in. So like most of the first sort of funds were more generalist funds, that said, okay, we just want to have an impact with whatever we do. But then over the years, they have also become more like sector specialized, which also allow them to be more impact focused, with their investment strategy. So they might say that, okay, we want to invest in education or healthcare or other impact themes, let's say, which then allows them to have certain objectives when it comes to what they want to achieve with their fund. So not just the financial return objective, but also an impact objective. And that allows them then to screen deals, so they have a number of companies that they could potentially invest in, and then they decide, okay, these companies seem to be viable for our and can be included in our investment thesis because they will allow us to achieve our impact objectives potentially, right? And then once they start working with those companies, during the due diligence, etc., they also understand better the impact that those companies want to achieve. So let's say that they invest in a company working on plant-based meat, which could be potentially an interesting topic for an investor. Then they say, okay, what can this company achieve in terms of impact? Well, the sort of idea behind companies working on plant-based meat would be that they're replacing consumption of meat, and then this would reduce CO2 emissions because, as you probably know, beef, is a big culprit when it comes to CO2 emissions. So if you can actually have sort of people switching from buying meat to buying this plant-based alternative, then you can actually reduce CO2 emissions. But of course, like, you're making certain assumptions that, so you want to understand who are going to be the buyers of this plant-based meat, because if it's going to be vegetarians, who otherwise, would be eating vegetables, and now instead of vegetables, then the impact is zero.
Yeah.
And so like one of the questions that you would ask is, okay, how do you know who's actually buying this? Who would be buying this meat? Okay, so these are the types of questions that the investor would be asking the potential investee to really see if they will have an impact. And then the sort of challenge as well when you're a kind of an early stage investor is that often the companies that you're investing in, they might not have the data yet or the evidence, right? So they say, yeah, our assumption is that our customers are going to be the ones that are otherwise would be eating meat, but we don't know that yet, right? So they need to set up a system where eventually they would be able to collect the data on the customers so that they would have that evidence, but they might not have that evidence at the very beginning. So for the impact investor, then they have these conversations, with the investee, and they try to understand what is called a theory of change, which is really about how are you addressing a specific social or environmental challenge, through your intervention, as an entrepreneur, and how are you planning to, in some ways, address that problem, alleviate that problem, eventually eliminate that problem, right? Which might be impossible, right? But especially for one single entrepreneur. But at least you want to understand how, through your activities, you're actually achieving some sort of change, in that problem. And that is what we call the theory of change. And then you kind of map out, how are your activities leading to that potential change, which is what we call impact. And then you want to understand, like, how are they going to measure that? Like, what are the indicators that they're going to be using for that? What is the evidence that they need to collect, etc. So it actually is quite a scientific, or if you will, like academic endeavor. Like you need to kind of have a theory, and then you have certain hypotheses on how to get there. So it is quite a rigorous process, and as an investor, you sort of need to understand that. As an impact investor, you need to understand that and have that conversation and dialogue with the entrepreneur. And then, as I said, like, if they don't have that evidence yet, at least you need to have a roadmap towards, okay, how are you going to be achieving that, and what kind of data will you be collecting in the future, so that you set that up from the very beginning. Because sometimes, like, you have an afterthought, like, okay, after a few years of working like that, oh, maybe I should have actually collected the data, but then you don't have a baseline, so you don't really know what progress you have made. And so this is part of the process, and the sort of the measurement part. And as you see, like, this is kind of, for an academic, quite an interesting and fascinating topic. I can, like, explain more detail, but you might want to go in a different direction. So
no, it's a very good direction. And I think you mentioned baseline because you wouldn't have started collecting data, but what you're talking about also is a need of an hypothesis. For example, for this plant-based startup that this VC would invest in, they have to have an hypothesis that this is going to replace meat for people who eat meat today. So you would need to define your indicators or KPIs to be able to track whether your hypothesis proved correct or not. We then touch on your golden nugget of theory of change, which is, if everyone who's buying this plant-based meat are already vegetarian, you have not done any change in terms of CO2 or methane. And then the limited partners who invested in that VC who's meant to do impact will be upset because there's nothing that has changed, or you can't prove anything changed.
Exactly. Yeah. And I guess that the other thing perhaps to keep in mind is that there are certain effects that are more short term and others that are more long term, right? So you might argue that this company, although the first customers that they have are vegetarians, eventually maybe they will get meat eaters to start start buying their product, because maybe in the beginning it doesn't taste so good, and then eventually, they start evolving, and they have, a better product, and so forth. So, the other thing is that you need to have probably more of these companies to actually create a new market. So it's a bit like, if you think about the electric car, and the sort of impact of Tesla and so forth, they have, you can say what you want about Elon Musk, but at least the sort of impetus of that kind of of Tesla has been enormous, in the sense of contributing to creating the EV market. So that could be sort of an effect as well that an impact investor might be interested in. Like, and we talk about systemic impact, and about how we, through investments, are also creating or changing systems, which is obviously, like, very difficult to measure, and it's much more long term, and it's not normally attributable to just one company. Normally you need to think about, like, how do companies work together in a sort of an ecosystem? What is the contribution of each company to solving, in together, let's say, how those companies and organizations are working towards solving a problem. And that's actually where the work of foundations becomes quite interesting. Okay, so I told you before that I work across the investment spectrum, not just with impact investors, but also with philanthropy. And where those types of organizations come in is that they tend to not just invest in companies, but they think more about systems and how what kind of partners do you need, to actually address problems. So if you think about, if you come back to my example, of the plant-based meat, there might be changes that you need to make in regulation. For example, you might need to work with policymakers. You might need to work with schools and education, to actually, change mindsets, and this will take time and so forth. So philanthropy, and of course, I mean, public sector as well is really important, in these changes. So what philanthropy can do that perhaps impact investors cannot do, is to work on these kind of more long-term problems, and also work on policy and advocacy and so forth, because those are activities that are not profitable, right? It's not going to be right. So it doesn't make sense, for an impact investor, like let's say that you have a venture capital fund, you have a limited time frame for your actions. I mean, normally it's like a 10-year fund, so you invest in the first 5 years and then you divest, and you invest in companies. Like you cannot put aside a lot of money for other things like building awareness and advocacy and so forth, because your LPs are going to say, like, what are you doing, so this is where philanthropy comes in, because they can work on these kind of broader topics, and they're not so restricted when it comes to the time frame and the financial returns that are required when you're working in investment.
I think the example of Tesla is interesting because it's hard to believe, but 10 years ago, many people still didn't think an electric car could be better than an engine car. And this was really a catalyst for change. And I think it's the same as your example about plant-based food. If you start to have them going through the cost curve, which was the same for Tesla and for electric car, and the performance improve, which would be the taste of the meat, it tastes really good, then you could imagine that starts to really make the change. I want to ask a question, because you talked about philanthropy, but also about venture philanthropy. What's the difference between the two, and how to think about venture philanthropy?
Okay, that's a great question, because that was actually the topic of my dissertation, so I can speak for hours. No. So I know venture philanthropy was a bit of sort of a reaction against traditional philanthropy, trying to deal with some of the issues of traditional philanthropy. And those are basically that a lot of foundations are providing grants to projects, and the issue is that they often provide grants to, let's say, like social sector organizations that are working on solving problems, but they tend not to fund the actual organization, but the projects that they run. So let's say that I'm running an educational association, and then I have certain projects that I'm leading when it comes to let's say helping kids improve their math skills, which is fantastic, but the foundation then tends to provide funding just for that, to run that project, which means that the actual organization that is running the project doesn't get much funding, and there's almost like an aversion against funding the core costs of social sector organizations, because you want to kind of make sure that the end beneficiaries get as much of the funding as possible. Which, in a way, like, okay, that makes sense, but how are they actually going to have people to run it? How are they going to pay for the managers and the people who are implementing the projects? Which means that basically social sector organizations are underfunded, and they're not able to attract talent and good people who actually are good at managing those projects. So it's a bit like a perverse situation, And this is what venture philanthropy was trying to sort of deal with. So they were saying, okay, and some of the people who started working on venture philanthropy some years ago, this was like 20 years ago, they were saying they were coming from venture capital. So they had been working in venture capital, they had a venture capital mindset, and they said, okay, I've had a nice career and now I want to give back to society, but really not just writing a check, but actually becoming involved in philanthropic projects myself. So I want to act as an investor and really help. And they said, okay, this is wrong. I mean, this is not working. Philanthropy is not working, because we're just kind of pouring money into lots of projects. We have no control over how the projects are run, what are the results of the project. So they were not measuring the impact. And also, as I said, like the actual organizations are not able to hire good people, and they're not able to have a long-term strategy. The funding tends to be short-term as well. So that was the issue that they were trying to solve. So they were saying, okay, let's see if we can instead fund the organizations. We can provide unrestricted funding to the organizations that are running the project, so that they actually are able to hire good people, have a long-term strategy, and implement really impactful projects. So that was kind of the switch from traditional philanthropy to venture philanthropy. So it was having more of a venture capital approach of like investing in companies, but not so much with the financial return objective. So the financial return, was not so important, at least not in the beginning. But sometimes they did notice that if you provide, for example, a loan rather than a grant, you might create a different type of relationship as well with the organization that you're funding. Because if there's a kind of an obligation to return the money, you also change your mindset of like, how are you going to use the money? And you also change the relationship with the one that is funding you, because if you just kind of get a handout, it's more like charity, and it's somehow like a different relationship. So that was also like the venture philanthropy organization started experimenting with different financing instruments. Okay, not just grants, but also debt, convertible instruments, and so forth, to also promote more of accountability, and more of this kind of a business mindset in philanthropy. So that's kind of and also the other thing was that it was more long-term funding, so it was not just, okay, I'm going to provide you with a grant for a year, but okay, more long-term grants. Okay, you have a grant for 5 years, with checkpoints and sort of accountability, and you have objectives that you need to achieve and so on. So it did not come with, okay, you just get the money and then we see you again in 5 years, but actually, okay, what do you need? How is it going? Do you need anything else from us? How can we help? So it was also this combination of financial and non-financial support, also like helping with strategy, maybe helping them hire good people and so forth. So really acting more like a venture capital type of investor.
I think there's a golden nugget. I like the way you said about grant versus loan, and the handout versus an expectations to return money. All of the projects are clearly about value creation. It had value to society. But if you have a loan, there's an expectation to return the money, which is there's an expectation to do a value capture. And if you do value capture, then you're creating a sustainable business which could hopefully scale and grow, impact to society. And then you said something which I think is worth double clicking. You said it's philanthropy, not charity. And I think most people will say that philanthropy is charity. So if you could just double click on this.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And it's actually another one of the sort of points that venture philanthropists were making, that they wanted to generate a culture of sustainability, financial sustainability in those organizations, so that it's not about, okay, I'm going to give you the money and then you use the money and then you need more money, right? And that's a bit the charity model, that, okay, you just kind of pour money into a problem, but first of all, the problem is not solved, so it persists, and you need to pour more money in it. But then also the organization is not becoming financially sustainable, meaning that it will be always dependent on external funding. So they wanted to also switch that into more of a financial sustainability model where they can also help those organizations, rethink perhaps their business model, so that they can get new sources of revenue, and so that they can become more financially sustainable and less dependent on external funding. I guess what I also wanted to make the point that that's not always possible, right? It's so we still need charity. We need, for a lot of problems in the world, we just need those grants and those handouts, because let's say we have an emergency situation, where there's an earthquake, and then you're not going to come in there and say, you have to be financially sustainable. We're not going to give you the money unless you're able to give it back in a year, to someone who's dying, right? That's not the thing, So it has to be the right types of interventions where there's a potential for financial sustainability. I can give you another example. I'm running a research center, and it's quite difficult to make research financially sustainable. You need actually funding to implement the research projects. We are thinking about things like, okay, if you launch like a training program, based on the content that we're producing through the research, that could generate some revenues and make us less dependent on external funding. But I think it's difficult with certain types of activities, like research, like advocacy, like emergency relief, and like pure charity. That's not going to be financially sustainable.
Okay, so I was saying, maybe one way to think about it is like an impact tool set. So you have charity, you have venture philanthropy, you have venture capital with impact-driven investment thesis and objectives. You need all of it. And one of the points about sustainability is, we invest in projects that are meant to create a more sustainable future, including for the environment. But as a corporate VC, we look at the ones that could capture value in a way that at some point they don't need VCs anymore, they can scale their impact. We invested in a company doing nuclear fusion. We hope at some point they will do plants that are profitable and they don't need VC money anymore and they can scale with green energy. I think the same for plant-based food. At some point, you want them to do really well and scale and the cost curve goes down. Everyone wants it.
So totally agree. And I think it's important also to keep in mind, that you need those different types of funders, across what you call like the investment spectrum. So from philanthropy to more, for-profit investment. I have tried to kind of understand how those different actors think. So that's why, like in recent years, I've also been involved in as an advisor and so forth, with different types of actors. So I'm now on the board of the GSMA Foundation, which is they work on mobile for development. So it's really the GSMA, which is the Association for mobile network operators across the world. And they have a really wonderful foundation that works on financial inclusion, gender equality, and climate change. So they're thinking about, things like, let's say, when it comes to gender equality, they're, obviously, like now mobile phones are available all over the world, but still there are certain areas of the world where, especially like rural parts of the world, in developing countries where maybe a family can only afford, one mobile phone, and then that usually goes to the man in the family, and also that then women, when they access the phones, the content on the phones, it's not really suitable for them, because the the ones that are developing content for mobile phones are not thinking about rural women. So this also generates lots of inequality, because we are advancing very fast, when it comes to technology, improving a lot, the processes and how we work. And then when certain people are just completely out of that, those advances, the inequalities really just increase. And so they work on projects to actually try to alleviate some of those inequalities, which is really interesting. But then, then you have the sort of venture capital impact investors that are working on more like early stage companies. Then you have more sort of private equity type of investors, later stage, and really trying to kind of also improve the sort of processes in the companies. Also sort of sustainable investors also working on maybe infrastructure projects, like really bigger ones. And then there's also this kind of polemic about could we call investment in public equity, sort of public markets, impact investing? Because one of the sort of terms that we use in impact investing to kind of define it, even, it's about additionality, meaning that through my investment, or am I investing in companies or projects that otherwise wouldn't get investment? If it weren't for me, let's say, which doesn't make sense when you're investing in public markets, because anyone could invest in those companies, right? So like that was one of the questions I asked when because I was advising, or I was asked to be an advisor to BlackRock on their impact strategy for their equity investments, and I did that for about a year. So that was my question: how can you be additional, as an investor in publicly traded companies? And they explained, that okay, as BlackRock, we are of course like one of the biggest investors in the world. So if we make an investment in a company, it has a strong signaling effect, meaning that it will crowd in other funding, and so they're sort of additional through how they're sort of signaling that this company, is worth investing in, on the one hand. And then the other part was also how they then help those companies prepare, for other investors, how they help them improve actually on impact areas. So they also make kind of a choice, which companies to invest in based on kind of their impact thesis and so on. And the companies need to have at least 50% of their revenues on a topic that is related to a sustainable development goal. So I mean, they had certain ways of doing that. Now they have discontinued that work, unfortunately. But it was interesting for me as an academic to see like how they think differently about it.
I think additionality is really tough. And here I'm going to think about from a venture capital point of view, because VCs, even impact VCs, need to invest in the entrepreneurs who are going to be the big winner of the future. And if they are identified as a big winner of the futures, many VCs will want to invest in them. And if that's true, then the additionality requirement means that you should not invest because you already have other investors investing. And so I always found the additionality criteria to be really, really hard because it goes against the sustainability of a good project being invested in. So how did you reconcile that when you were advising on additionality? Because this is one I don't have an answer. I don't know how to think about additionality in a way that is sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think there are sort of also different ways of thinking of additionality. So one is what I mentioned before, that okay, if it weren't for me as an investor, this company wouldn't get financing. But then if you're like more a finance first impact investor, then you're like, okay, why would you invest in a company that no one else wants to invest in a way, right? So that's a bit the issue. Like, and it works if you're what we call, we sometimes distinguish between what we call impact first and finance first impact investors. Like, so impact first impact investors are more close to venture philanthropy. The focus is really much more on the impact and less on the financial return. So you might sort of be happy if you just get your money back, because compared to philanthropy, that's still very different, right? In philanthropy, you give the money away and you don't get any money back, because you're just giving grants. Whereas in venture philanthropy, or like impact first, impact investing, you invest in projects that some of them might, return money, and some of them won't. But you're not like looking for huge financial returns. And if you have that approach, then the additionality is clearer, right? Because you actually will be providing funding to projects that otherwise wouldn't get funding. And this is additional because it's clearly additional, let's say. And it's okay if you don't make so much money, let's say. If you are a finance first impact investor, the additionality is more complex, right? It's so you might be additional because you have a proprietary pipeline of investment opportunities. So you are actually like very good at identifying those opportunities, and you are like the first investor in companies that perhaps otherwise wouldn't have been identified, by more like mainstream investors, because you see the potential in the company because of the impact, and you also try then to, if you're a finance first impact investor, you try to invest in companies where there's a correlation between the impact and the revenue growth of the company, so that by growing the revenues, you're also growing the impact. It tends to be where the beneficiaries, like the ones that are benefiting from the solution, are also the customers. Because it's a bit like, okay, by selling more products, you're also increasing your impact. So we call it market lockstep when it comes to impact. So coming back to the issue of additionality, in these cases, it could be because you're the first investor, but it could also be because, and then you kind of crowd in other investors, which is fine. And it could also be because you're providing non-financial support in a way that others cannot. So you're helping them think about their impact, you're helping them measure their impact, articulate the impact, so that it becomes a selling point of what they do as a company, and also sort of collect the right evidence and like deepen their own understanding of impact. So you're additional, not just through the financial investment, but also through the non-financial support that you're providing.
I think when we think in venture capital, we like to think about superpower, which we can bring to the entrepreneurs. And probably for BlackRock, it's the signal. We actually interviewed on the podcast DBL Partners, a really amazing VC, probably one of the first, if not the first impact VC more than 20 years ago. And they are called DBL because double bottom line, because they have to invest both for impact as well as financial returns. But for corporate VCs, maybe the additionality is about being able to bring a special go-to-market, or being able to de-risk the technology like no one else could. So I think you're helping me to reconcile how to think of additionality in a way where it fits the superpower concept of venture capital. So,
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that idea of superpower, and thinking a little bit about, I guess it's about your value proposition, no? As a funder in the investment spectrum. So, what is it that that you can really add? What value can you add? As in that particular position in the spectrum, but also thinking about the resources that you have, right?
yeah. And mm. Superpowers imply something unique, which is, I think, part of the additionality.
No, exactly. Yeah, yeah. I like that.
Okay, very nice. Let me talk about Europe a little bit because you're clearly based in Europe, in Spain, but you've been in different parts of Europe. How do you see impact investing and the ecosystem around it evolving in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years?
Um, yeah. So obviously, like this is what I do, so I'm quite optimistic, about the evolution. I think I've seen a tremendous growth, in the past 10 years. So I started, as I mentioned, I started working on this like 20 years ago, and I'm based in Spain. I'm from Sweden originally, actually, but I worked in Brussels, at the European Venture Philanthropy Association, which is now called Impact Europe. So I was also involved in sort of policy discussions with the European Commission and so forth. Um, and that was an interesting experience because I think I was kind of skeptical about working with policymakers before that, thinking, oh, they're bureaucrats, and it's a bit like the this impression that we have probably of sort of European government. You think it's a lot of bureaucrats sitting there, and they don't really know what they're doing. I mean, that's sometimes the impression that people have. And I think like working with the European Commission on policy for impact investing has been really interesting, because I realized first of all that they just want to do what's best for the sector. So they were asking us as experts and the early practitioners, what is it that you need? How can we help? And it's been a very kind of productive dialogue from the beginning, where they were also talking about like what kind of regulation do we need to put into place, but we don't want to stifle the sector. We want to make sure that we're providing the right conditions for growth, and so forth. So I think that made me quite uh, optimistic about how policy can work in a good way, and the sort of impact investing has grown quite a lot in certain countries. So France is a good example. Germany, Spain has really prospered, in the past few years, which has been wonderful to see. So we have, um, in the past few years, a lot of new funds have been set up. There's now a wholesale fund of funds, 400 million euros, that is investing in impact funds in Spain, with money coming from the European Commission, actually. So that's how things are moving. So that has been a combination of, on the one hand, like good policy, I think, also some funding from, as I mentioned before, the European Investment Fund had a fund of funds as well that has been instrumental in helping the first impact funds actually get their anchor investor that helped them also get other private funders to come in. So I think, I mean, what I see is like that's just growing. There are certain parts of Europe that are still, um, that still lack impact funds of a certain size. So like Eastern Europe, and probably, probably is like the least developed so far. But there are also certain vehicles that have been created especially for that. to kind of promote investment there. I guess, I mean, when I started working on venture philanthropy, I realized that in order for venture philanthropy to prosper, you needed to have both philanthropy and venture.
Yeah.
So if you have, in certain countries in Europe, you might have, a strong venture capital sector, um, but you don't have any philanthropy, and then vice versa. And so like the best sort of market conditions are really when both of those are present. So like in the UK has been, I guess, the first country in Europe to really grow in terms of venture philanthropy and impact investing, and I think because the conditions were there, in terms of like both those types of funding available in that mindset. So kind of putting that mindset together is really what impact investing is about. So yeah, I mean, I'm quite optimistic, and I also feel like not just in terms of policy and in terms of funding, but also in terms of talent. So as a professor at a business school, and I'm teaching social entrepreneurship and impact investing, I definitely have a lot of interest from students who want to work in the field of impact investing. So they are asking for career advice. They in the past few years, like when I started at Esade, I was sort of getting some requests, from students. Can you help me? Can you put me in touch with, this and that? And I mean, I have quite a nice network in impact investing, so I try to make sure that if I have a good student, that I can recommend that student to impact investors that I believe could be a good employer for them, right? I realized after a while that it was beyond my capacities as an individual to help all the students. So we also created a sort of a link with our career department, so that they have become now experts as well on impact. And they're helping us, and we put together a career guide on, for students who want to work on impact. And we have something called a social impact lab in the MBA program, where students who are interested become, or like have a specialized track, where they get access to, where we have sort of career talks, and we have like certain projects that they can work on. We have some master classes where they get some expertise on impact measurement and other topics, and we also help them sort of prepare for a career in impact. And this is also growing every year. We have more students who are interested in this. So that's also what I find fascinating and also encouraging. That it's not just the funds that are being set up and the policies, but it's really like young people who are very talented, who want to have a great career. Obviously, like if they come to a business school and they're paying for an MBA, they're quite ambitious, and they want to channel that energy into an impact-driven career. So this is what makes me excited and happy as well as a professor.
When we talk about ambition, I think wanting to have a big impact to society is about being ambitious. So I think at the end, it's all about people and making sure that we get the right talent with the right ambition to do the best they can. What I like about what you mentioned, and I think the name is quite interesting, is Social Impact Lab, which I think implies that they learn by doing small projects before they can go and make a big project. Am I understanding right the concept of the lab?
Yeah, yeah. That was really the idea. Like when we launched it was a bit of an experimentation. I mean, I had been discussing this with some business schools in the US, who had similar activities. But really, I mean, what we want to provide for students is an opportunity to get their hands dirty, in a way, like to experiment, to do things here already in at school, that they will be doing in the field of practice. And I think it's also how we try to teach them. So we have several courses on the topic of impact investing, impact measurement, and as a professor, you try to kind of put together a curriculum that is, in a way, has some structure, has some theory, but they want to try it out, right? Like we also collaborate with several impact investing funds, when developing the courses, so that we can bring in real examples that they can use. Like we have one course called Impact Investing in Action. We do this with a debt fund called MCE Social Capital. They invest in developing markets, and what we do is that the students they pretend that they are working for MCE Social Capital. So and we have a practitioner coming in from MCE Social Capital that works through the course with us, and the students then get some investment opportunities that they have to decide whether they fit into the investment strategy of MCE Social Capital, and then they screen out, some of the opportunities, and then they choose, some companies to invest in that they want to invest in, and they conduct a due diligence of that company, and then they have to ask the due diligence questions and like really like dig deep into like both the financials and the impact. And then in the last session, they make a proposal to the investment committee, like, okay, are we going to invest or not in this company? For which reasons, and what would be like the structure of the deal, and so forth. So it's really hands-on, and it's a lot of fun because
Yep.
The students are like really passionate, and they become like that you can really tell that they're putting themselves in the shoes, of a real impact investor.
Very nice because it's very applied. You really learn the job of an investor. You have to think through everything. So I think you're probably going to tempt many people in the audience to check it out. But we're getting to the end of the podcast, and I have one more question I want to ask. And it's nice you're optimistic, so that's a good question to ask. What do you think success will look like for venture philanthropy 10 years from now? What does success look like?
For venture philanthropy?
Mm.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm thinking that
this is your time to be ambitious and optimist.
Yeah, I guess like one of the things that I'm curious about myself, when it comes to venture philanthropy, there's a sort of an assumption and a promise that you're adding value, to the organizations that you're investing in or you're financing. So like one of the things that I want to be able to do is actually show that venture philanthropy works. So in a way that it's somehow like better than traditional philanthropy in for certain topics. So like that was one of the things that I would like to be able to show. It's one of the projects I'm working on actually. I hope that it's not going to take another 10 years to show that, but sometimes that in academia things are move a little bit slowly. But I also think, it would be wonderful if this is a topic that is on the top of corporate venturing agendas, so corporate foundations that are working on on philanthropy, that they really think that this is a practice and a way of working, which is a kind of natural thing. And I think it would be totally natural for corporate foundations to work in this way. So that would be success. And that people are actually know, when I say venture philanthropy, that like people understand what that means. I maybe like a very short anecdote, like my daughter, when she was probably like 4 or 5, she comes up to me and she goes, venture philanthropy, and I'm like, wow, how did you learn that? And she's like, oh, you say it all the time, So, I think it's still one of those things that maybe it's not so well known. so that if this becomes something that people talk about and that people understand, and it becomes a natural practice for foundations, I think that would be success.
Very nice. And that would make it part of the tool set for impact. Lisa,
Exactly.
thank you so much for your time and sharing with us all of the impact investing and venture philanthropy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.